Hello and welcome to this session of The Exchange, Conversations for a Better Future. This is a special conversation ahead of Earth Day, where we plan to speak about one of the most critical priorities, tackling climate change and how countries on the front line are adapting to the physical changes they're seeing due to the warming of our planet. I'm Haslinda, Amin, anchor for Bloomberg Television. It is my pleasure to be your guest host for the next 45 minutes as part of this occasional series. And this series is meant to build back in some of the conversations between IMF leadership and key global stakeholders that are critical to building a sustainable recovery from the crisis. Do tweet using the hashtag IMF Exchange. I'd like to welcome our two guests today, Kristalina Georgieva, Managing Director of the IMF, Simon Kofe, the Foreign Minister of Tuvalu. The minister has been nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for his speech at last year's COP26 conference, delivered in knee-deep seawater. Here's an excerpt.
We are living the realities of climate change, sea level rise, as you stand watching me today at COP26. We cannot wait for speeches when the sea is rising around us all the time. Climate mobility must come to the forefront. We must take bold, alternative action today to secure tomorrow. Tuvalu moderno.
A vivid reminder of the reality of climate change. Tuvalu, by the way, lies in the South Pacific, midway between Australia and Hawaii. At its highest point, it's just 4.5 meters above sea level. Minister Kofe, pictures of you knee-deep in seawater, trouser legs rolled up, have gone viral, to say the least. What prompted the speech? What reactions have you seen?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Jessica, for the opportunity to speak today. I wasn't able to attend COP. We had to cut down our delegation given the COVID restrictions back home. But I received an invitation to speak at a side event, and I thought, what better way to demonstrate the impacts of climate change than to actually stand in the water. I wasn't too sure how the response was going to be, but as we know, it went viral, and I'm very pleased that it's brought more attention to the issues of climate change and the impacts that we're facing at the moment.
And are you optimistic that perhaps the visual of you knee-deep in seawater would prompt, I guess, a reaction from the international community to do more?
Yeah, well, that's what we're hoping, and that's what really matters, is that we're seeing stronger climate action from countries. Obviously, we didn't get what we wanted from COP26, but I think the key here is really to bring greater awareness, not just to the leaders that are making decisions, but to the general public, because I believe that once these issues become sort of the forefront of their thinking, they're the ones who put pressure on their leaders to ensure that the policies and decisions they're making is addressing climate change, because it might be an issue for Tuvalu today, but it certainly is going to be affecting the whole world.
Kristalina, as we've been saying, climate change is such a critical issue. It's been talk. It's time to walk. And the IMF is stepping up its engagement on climate change. Talk to us about what is being done and what does it mean for how you're advising members.
Let me first thank Minister Kofe for joining us today, but mostly for shaking up the consciousness of millions of people who saw him standing in this water. A bleak future for many of these islands. And to recognize that for the International Monetary Fund, an institution that is set to guard macroeconomic and financial stability and promote growth and employment, no more we can do that without taking climate change into account. Why? Because climate risks already present are bringing down growth and affecting employment, shaking up macroeconomic stability. A hurricane can wipe out 200% of GDP of a country, as it happened in 2 years ago in the Dominica. So we are clear that it is our task to understand the link between a changing climate and the functioning of the economy, but also because tackling climate change presents opportunities for low-carbon, climate-resilient growth that puts the world on a more sustainable path. What we do at the IMF, 3 fundamental things. One, when we take the pulse of national economies or regions or the global economy, we factor in climate risks and opportunities to tackle climate change. So when we next time go to Tuvalu, hopefully the COVID restrictions would be lifted for our consultation on the economy, we will talk about adapting to climate change. We did this last time looking into ways we can support Tuvalu to raise more money for climate finance. 2, we integrate climate risks in our financial stability assessments so we can judge whether investments we make today are good for tomorrow. And 3, we are looking into ways in which we can provide financial resources to countries. We are creating a new instrument at the IMF. We call it Resilience and Sustainability Trust that can help countries for long-term transformation of their economies to low-carbon, climate-resilient future.
Before we talk about the trust and adaptation, Mr. Kofe, share with us the view from where you are. Tuvalu, 8 islands, 12,000 people at the front lines of climate change. We know that the World Bank says sea levels in the Western Pacific have risen 3 times the global average. What are you seeing where you are?
Mm-hmm. Well, we are seeing sea level rise and erosion on our coastal waters. In fact, during the king tides, about 40% of the central district is flooded because not only is the ocean coming up on the coast, but it's also seeping through the ground. So many of our parts of the island that I'm on gets flooded during king tides. So it means that our soil is very salty, so it makes it very difficult to grow crops, which then is linked to health issues because we're importing a lot of our goods and we're eating more processed foods. We're seeing the acidification of our coral reefs. So there's a number of issues that we are facing, and when we're talking about climate change, it's really an issue of our survival and our existence as a state and as a people. And so there is certainly a lot of stake when we're talking about climate change and Tuvalu.
So what are the key challenges faced by the government? How does climate impact its day-to-day running?
Well, it affects us in many ways. Obviously, I mentioned the health issues that are connected with that. And Tuvalu being so isolated and so far away from the markets, it means that we are paying a higher cost because of freight and getting access to the markets is so far away. But at the moment, our focus is really on to be able to protect our islands, to be able to build seawalls and reclaim land. That's been the focus, and you can imagine how costly those things are for us. And so, those are one of the many challenges that we're facing at the moment.
Kristalina, you talked about adaptation earlier, how the IMF is helping island states like Tuvalu to adapt. Give us a sense of the IMF's thinking when it comes to adaptation versus mitigation policies. I mean, a lot of countries talk about mitigation more than they do adaptation.
We recognize at the IMF that we have to do both. We have to reduce emissions to mitigate, and we have to adapt to what is already a changing climate. When we talk about Tuvalu, this is a picture into our own future everywhere. Because what we know, what we see, is that climate change is an existential risk. So for the fund, what we deploy is what we know best, and it is how to change economic policies towards an important objective. And how we do that? On the mitigation side, we came to recognize that everybody, producers, consumers, ought to receive an incentive to reduce carbon emissions. And that is best done by a carbon price. So where are we today? Nowhere. Carbon price per ton is about $3 to $4. By 2030, it has to be $75 a ton if we want to change behavior fast enough for this dream of sustaining average temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are saying to everybody that introducing carbon price predictably doesn't have to start from the top, but we need to have a trajectory so we can integrate it in our decision making. Secondly, we promote public investments where they would make a difference to shift this trajectory towards low carbon. Of course, public investments have to go in emerging markets and developing countries. Because if they don't, whatever the rich world achieves just wouldn't be enough. But then we also recognize something hugely important, that we have to place mitigation and adaptation financing on equal footing. We are advocating for 50-50. 50% goes for adaptation, 50% goes for mitigation as development support goes to the developing world. Some institutions have gotten there, some not quite yet. And I hope, for the sake of those whose lives depend on us doing the right thing, that we move in that direction. And if I may finish with one very important point on financing, and it has to support a just transition within countries and across countries. And just transition means that those who have contributed very little to the risks of climate change cannot be left on their own to deal with its consequences. Tuvalu cannot be left only to the small population of Tuvalu to finance resilient future. The IMF has been speaking loud and clear that if we think of our common future, then those who can do and finance more ought to do it now. And this is why also at the IMF we are putting together our own contribution, the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. We want to start with 30 billion, grow it to at least $50 billion, be a small part of the solution the world needs. As you said, talk the talk, good. More important, walk the walk.
The thing is, Kristalina, adaptation will become increasingly expensive. Right now, it's estimated at 1% of GDP in about 50 lower income countries. And for small island states, the cost could go up as high as 20% of GDP. What do you do about that? What can you do about that when there is so much reluctance already among richer nations?
Well, the very first thing to do is a promise was made that by 2020, the rich world would transfer $100 billion a year for climate action, mitigation and adaptation to the developing world. So the first thing first, make sure that the 100 billion flows in the right direction. Secondly, we know that public money can only take us that far, that the big transformation requires massive trillions of dollars of investment, and that can only be done if private capital does the right thing. that it invests in low carbon energy, transport, urban development, and in climate resilient agriculture, coastal zones protection. And we also know that there are ways in which we can help nature to help us, and we are not yet doing enough. Take, for example, mangroves restoration or reforestation. These are ways in which we can enrich biodiversity, improve fisheries, and at the same time protect against storms. So my message is, if we want to have a resilient, sustainable future, we have to invest today. And by the way, your 1% a year would become 2%, 3%, 5% if we are slow to act. The more we delay action, the more expensive it becomes.
Before I get to Minister Kofe to talk about how his country is adapting, you've often talked about how debt levels are at unsustainable levels. Can countries spend on climate adaptation without increasing public debt?
Well, one of the topics of discussion in the climate and finance community is whether we can build more instruments to address debt and climate at the same time. There has been some experience with debt for climate swaps. I believe that we can do more in that direction. And at the IMF, we have been exploring whether there can be debt reduction linked to sustainability, linked to implementing plans for adaptation and mitigation, and do that recognizing that those who write off debt, being private or public, they also need to get recognition for their actions. And in that sense, thinking about an incentive for everybody to work together is what we see potential for. But you're absolutely correct. The pandemic has hit low-income countries the hardest. There is a dangerous divergence in economic fortunes between richer countries and poorer countries, and debt levels have shot up. Now, with financial conditions tightening as a result of the war in Ukraine, of Russia's invasion of this country, we see a risk that debt service is going to jump, making investments in climate action even harder for poorer countries. And this is why we are also stating clearly, and we are going to use our discussions during the spring meetings on how we can have more effective debt restructuring, debt reduction, especially for low-income countries under severe climate stress. There is a common framework for debt resolution that the G20 adopted. We want to see this common framework delivering more effectively than it has done so far.
Minister Kofe, it's about future-proofing Tuvalu. How has the government adapted? What has been the timeline and the process for this?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. We have a number of projects going on at the moment. We have, on a small scale, the growing of mangroves along our shores. We also have a project under the Green Climate Fund, looking at building seawalls on 3 of the islands of Tuvalu. But we, as you said, future-proofing for the worst-case scenario. For Tuvalu, the worst-case scenario is that our islands could be fully submerged by the end of the century. And so the government has been working on a worst-case scenario. And one of the, obviously, the things that we can do from our side is how do we protect even our statehood? Can we still be recognized as a state under international law if our lands are fully submerged? Or our people are forced to relocate, and so we're looking at legal avenues to be able to secure our statehood. One of those ways is insisting that countries that want to establish diplomatic ties with Tuvalu recognized the proposition that a state can exist without a physical territory. Obviously, it's a completely new area because we've never had a state in the history of mankind disappear under the ocean. The other area where we're looking at is looking at technology and how we are able to digitize and protect our government services, our cultural knowledge, to be able to build Tuvalu as a digital nation. And obviously, there's a lot of things that we're exploring at the moment. But it all comes down to, as much as we depend on our partners to come through with their support, we're not going to be sitting around as well waiting for them to sort of get their act together. It's important that we are proactive as a country and looking at ways what can we do now to be able to secure our future. And so that's been the attitude, the mindset of the government, is to be able to do those things now.
So Tuvalu experimenting with digital nationhood based on blockchain pretty much. Where is Tuvalu in its digital transformation? Give us a sense of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a number of projects going on at the moment, obviously digitizing many of our processes, which makes us more efficient, helps us to collect data. The service is improved for the general public. But we are exploring blockchain, as you may have heard. We're looking at blockchain and how that could be the platform for all our applications, to house our applications moving forward. We're still at the stage of, we've done a feasibility study last year, and we've also engaged the team from Monash to do an assessment to see what is the best technology for us moving forward.
So is the plan to go completely digital, a national ledger, cashless economy, virtual token to replace your currency to ensure it exists even when or if it is swallowed by the sea?
Mm-hmm. That's definitely on the cards for us. It's we see that as in the medium to the long term that we will have all those things developed and established in Tuvalu. Obviously, you need good internet connectivity to be able to run many of those applications, and that's why the focus for us right now is on infrastructure, to be able to have the infrastructure in place to ensure that we have internet access and a good quality internet access for people in Tuvalu. So that's definitely something down the track, but we are moving towards that.
Mm-hmm. Kristalina, let's revert back to you on how island states like Tuvalu can finance all these investments, and what more can they do, and what more can the IMF do?
Let me first say that we are very happy to have Tuvalu as one of our 190 members. They joined the IMF in 2010, and that shows the wisdom of making sure the country is there, given the bleak prospects in the worst-case scenario the minister talked about. What we see is to help countries that are struggling with very difficult adaptation needs. First and foremost, to make best use of their own resources. In other words, to think about their future with clear-eyed vision for what this future may be. And what we heard from Simon about building on digitalization to keep Tuvalu together and connected to the world is a very wise investment. It is an investment in resilience of the country. Secondly, as I said, it is very important that the world recognizes its own responsibility, especially the parts of the world that have grown on the basis of using fossil fuels. They have reached a level of wealth. And now we all need to factor in the environmental costs of this wealth. Part of it is to support the countries that are behind that also have aspirations for better lives for their people, and they have to adapt to a changing climate. And this is not a joke. Adaptation is for everybody a priority, but in particular for those communities that are faced with already significant physical risks. And three institutions like mine, the IMF, to make sure that what we do to finance our membership is done with an eye of mitigating risks, reducing risks that are already present and would be more severe in the future. And that, if I were to sum it up in one message, it is we are all in this together. And only by bringing all our skills and capabilities, we can steer through the dangers climate change presents to us. It is my real great honor to be with somebody who is on the very front line of dealing with the climate risks, and my respect goes to you and everybody. And if I can tell you a little anecdote from Tuvalu, my colleagues, I was asking them, okay, you went there. I haven't been in Tuvalu. I actually taught in the university. Simon graduated from the University of the South Pacific in Fiji. But I asked them, what can you say about Tuvalu? And they say, look, this is such a unique place, and it is so clear that it would be so dramatic for people to be uprooted. For example, they said the most unique airport is in Tuvalu, because the airport is airport only 3-4 times a week. The rest of the time, it is the most exciting stadium where people play soccer, where there are games. 30 minutes before an airplane is to come, a car comes, kicks out everybody from this field. How do you take away what is your home? And this is why, Simon, you're doing the right thing to passionately talk about our common responsibility to everyone on this planet, including to these citizens of beautiful Tuvalu.
Kristalina, it's also about bringing climate adaptation into the mainstream of fiscal planning. Are you seeing that already?
A lot is happening, and of course it is happening more in countries that are already suffering dramatic consequences from climate change. Rich and poor. The Netherlands, that lives under sea level, is a country with a great deal of experience in this regard, and so are, of course, island countries. And what it means, and our fiscal affairs experts reinforce this message, is to think about your revenues and your expenditures with an eye on, are they helping or hurting your sustainability? One of the first lessons that are drawn is that the same way we think about fiscal buffers for economic shocks, we need to think about fiscal buffers for climate shocks. Secondly, that we cannot secure country by country by country. We have to pool risks. And the more we pool the risks, the better off we are in preventing their impact. And third, we see more and more very strong attention to what money gets spent for. If we were to invest in infrastructure, is this infrastructure climate-proofed? If we are to invest in agriculture, is this taking into account higher temperatures, more climate events? And that changing the screen through which we review fiscal affairs is paramount. It is so very important that we embrace it today, even in places where shocks are still not as dramatic, although these places are fewer and fewer.
We talked about how it is a higher rate environment. That means heavily indebted small and developing economies will see their debt payments climb even more. Might the IMF need another infusion for its SDR program. Do you see that happening?
Well, first thing first, what we did last year was historic. We issued $650 billion equivalent in SDR allocation to our members. Everybody got their part, but some of our members received SDRs they don't really need because they have strong reserve positions. So what we are doing today is a call to on-land SDRs from countries that got it, don't need it, to countries that are in dire need of more financial resources. This is how we are going to fund the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. It is going to be approved, hopefully, by our board of directors prior to our spring meetings. In other words, we are going to go to the spring meetings with it, and it would be operational by October. Our goal, raise enough money to make it meaningful, part of this global response that is necessary. And then, of course, we need to think what more we can do. You're absolutely correct. I want to praise the staff of the IMF. They have really zeroed in on adaptation. They have published a number of papers on the fiscal affairs issue you asked, on where in the most vulnerable parts like Middle East, North Africa region, where are the risks and how they can be addressed. In other words, we are doing all we can to inform ourselves and our members on what they can practically do to be stronger in the face of climate shocks.
So just to be sure, you're quite confident that the trust will be implemented by meetings in October. Are there challenges to that?
Yes. I'm confident. And I'm confident because our membership has embraced a role for the IMF on climate. We have a board-approved climate strategy, and it is people like Simon who have made it visually so clear we need to act. So comes October, we will have the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. So Tuvalu, like all, basically 2/3 of our membership will be eligible. Countries that are vulnerable to climate risks and countries that want to strengthen their resilience.
Mr. Kofe, what would you like to see from the international community immediately? What would you like them to do, something that they can do immediately?
Well, first, it's very pleasing to hear the IMF's role and what they are doing to address this issue. So that's very pleasing to hear. I guess with what we really need from our partners is that support for adaptation projects. As I said, these are very expensive undertakings, and in most cases, our experience is that many of our partners are reluctant to contribute to the bigger projects that are actually quite critical for the protection of Tuvalu. I guess the other issue as well is that when determining the support that comes to Tuvalu, they often look at the population, the size of the population. And as you know, Tuvalu, there's only 11,000 people. It's one of the smallest countries in the world. But then, it's important not just to look at the population, but to look at the vulnerability of the country to determine what level of support that needs to come to Tuvalu. So I feel Tuvalu is, it's on the front line, but it's also a key, area that we need to address. Our view is that if you're able to save Tuvalu now, then you essentially be able to save the world. Because if we're not able to address this issue now, then it makes it very difficult down the track to do anything about it. So I think we're at a critical time, and it's important that countries that have made pledges, that they go through with that and implement that. And that's what we're looking for from our partners.
Is there a message you'd like to send to big emitters, including neighboring Australia?
Yeah, I think it's we talked about the justice of all of climate change. Tuvalu and many other the smaller developing countries, contribute the least to the problem that we're having right now. But yet we are facing the full brunt of it. So it's important that the bigger emitters take greater responsibility for the crisis that we are facing right now. And I understand there are many, it's often difficult because there are economic interests, economic considerations, and national interests. But I think we've reached a stage in our development that we are so interconnected that we just can't think like that anymore. We are now vulnerable to each other's actions, and it's important that we, there's a leadership, a paradigm shift in the leadership to see the emerging context that we're in right now, and for all countries to take greater responsibility for the problem that we're facing right now.
In your speech, you talked about Kaitasi, the world coming together, working together. Are you hopeful the world will work together to meet the pledges made at COP26, even though you're quite disappointed with those pledges made? Will enough be done soon enough to keep Tuvalu from disappearing?
Even if these countries that made pledges in COP26 were able to fully implement those pledges, the scientists are saying that we're looking at a 2.4, 2.6 degrees increase. And that basically means that Tuvalu won't be around by the end of the century. So it's important. It's important that countries go through with what they've said, and we're still waiting on a number of countries to do that. But I think we're at a critical time, and for us, it's our survival, and that's why we're very concerned with the where we are at this point in time.
Kristalina, we heard from the minister saying it is about survival. What gives you cause for hope and reasons for concern?
What gives me hope is that we are now much more conscious about the risks of climate change. Mother Nature helped because there are floods and forest fires and hurricanes affecting everybody. You talked about Australia. It is burning or flooded on regular intervals. And when public opinion surveys ask this question, do you want to do something to take action, 80% of the respondents in the recent survey said, yes, we do. We know we have to. What gives me reason to be quite worried is the timeliness of this action. Remember when we went to Glasgow? Pledges were made, very ambitious pledges, for net zero by mid-century. Almost 85% of emissions are now covered by pledges. But pledges for what we would do between now and 2030 felt 50% short vis-a-vis what we need if we are to keep 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. So time is not on our side. Time is not our friend. We do have to act with that sense of urgency that scientists are telling us so many times is to do if we want to have the destiny of prosperity and opportunities for our children and our grandchildren. For the 11,000 people.
Have changed, but it's not enough, Kristalina.
I was just saying for the 11,000 people of Tuvalu, we need to act now.
Minister Kofe, your message to the global community?
Well, the message has always been the same. Obviously, is that we've reached a stage now that countries cannot act on their own, and we're seeing this with COVID-19. We're seeing this with the wars in different parts of the world. It affects all of us. So it's important that leaders need to think like that when looking at the issue of climate change. You need to balance out your national interests and your immediate economic interests with the well-being of the world at large. And so that's the message. And if leaders can't get their act together, then the people need to put pressure on their leaders to address these issues of climate change, because it affects everyone, and it's the as we've heard, it's the future generation that will be facing the challenges even worse than what we're facing today. So I guess that's the message to yeah.
And to borrow the Tuvaluan word, kaitasi, they're all coming together to work together for a common cause. On that note, I'd like to thank Kristalina and Minister Kofe for their insights on such a critical issue for the world. Thank you for joining us. And just a reminder to tweet using the hashtag IMF Exchange. And finally, Mr. Kofe, we wish you all the best for the Nobel Peace Prize nomination.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you both. Thank you.
Thank you.